This meeting is being recorded.
Good morning, comrades. As Comrade Rich said, I'll be presenting on the first paper. All these papers are part of CJCM Strategic Perspectives to Accelerate and Deepen the Just Transition. So the first discussion document is titled Resisting Climate Apartheid and Eco-cidal Capitalism Towards a Global Climate Justice Bloc for a Just World Peace, Earth Democracy, and Climate Justice Deal for Africa. So the document is outlined in the following way. Firstly, the introduction, and then we talk about climate apartheid and the eco-cidal logic of capitalism. And then we try to understand carbon capital's victory and how it enabled the lock-in of fossil fuels. And then we examine the Glasgow COP that we just had and how it just led to the continuity of the eco-fascist project. And then we examine the maturing contradictions and capitalism's own systemic disruptions. From there, we talk about symbolic climate justice resistance, moving from symbolic climate justice resistance to a climate justice bloc of governments, workers, peoples, and movements. And then we examine fighting for what is essential for survival, the South African Climate Justice Project. And finally, we look at challenges to planetize the movement to end ecocidal capitalism. So, comrades, carbon capitalism is basically like a snake that is eating its own tail. And throughout its history, we have seen several crises of capitalism, known as general crises, from 1870 and 1914 to the interwar years, to the early 1990s, and then from around 2007 until now, we have seen these general crises of capitalism. And the most frightening thing is that these general crises of capitalism lead to violence. If you check the first general crisis, it led to the First World War, and then the Second World War, and there's been instabilities in the 1970s. Now, what is different about capitalism's general crisis now is that it has the ability to annihilate the human race, because we have our weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons, and so on and so forth. So throughout the different waves of capitalism and throughout its expansion, it has always led to the enclosure of the commons, whether it's your land, whether it's water or biodiversity and labor. Capitalism has always led to the enclosure of these things. And we've seen it happening now with these attempts to privatize our water, the dispossessions of land historically, and so on and so forth. The war against nature, the war that has led to what is now being called the insect apocalypse, basically destroying pollinators and threatening our food system. So capitalism is centered on the domination of nature, the domination of women, and the racial other. And throughout its history, it has always put the white man as the symbol of civilization, bringing civilization to the world, and so on and so forth. So it's a process of enclosure, appropriation, and domination. One that is at war against nature, one that destroys our natural commons, hence we call it ecocidal capitalism. So we are now living in the age of the neoliberal class project, of course, with its own lock-ins, with its own structural adjustment programs, with its own austerity measures. Now, the neoliberal project has led to deep systemic crisis tendencies, just like other waves of capitalism. It has led to a polycrisis, a crisis of socio-ecological reproduction, something that we touched on several times yesterday. Now, this neoliberal class project, of course, has resulted in welfare regimes. It has resulted in deindustrialization, precarious labor market regimes, and of course, unit labor cost manufacturing. We are consistently seeing workers around the world earning slave wages, basically, not even sufficient to be called a living wage. So, but this neoliberal project has taken on a new face in that it is now authoritarian neoliberalism, one that prioritizes transnationalized property classes, one that prioritizes monopoly capital, and very thin market democracies. Now, what this means is that the neoliberal class project is basically undermining democracy because it's leading to thin market democracies that prioritize those who are owning capital, just like it isn't the case with South Africa. So basically, it's a threat to democracy, if you can put it that way. And it's continuing this global eco-fascist project. It's continuing this polycrisis. And the fact of the matter is that the polycrisis we are seeing now, it cannot be fixed with shallow reformism and all these techno fixes that are being implemented by the state. What needs to happen are deep and systemic reforms like food sovereignty alternatives, like land and water commoning, like the things that we are currently working on and they've been talking about. Techno fixes, for example, techno fixes of geoengineering, they cannot be able to help us out of the climate crisis. In fact, they will lead to other consequences that were previously unseen. So all this shallow reformism within the same system cannot cut it. All these techno fixes cannot work. What we need are deep and systemic alternatives. So climate apartheid and the eco-cidal logic of capitalism. Now, the logic of climate apartheid is that there are some people and there are some nations that are just simply expandables. We've been hearing the calls, especially from island nations who are facing the disastrous impacts of the climate crisis, whose areas have become unlivable because of rising sea levels, because of tropical cyclones that are induced by the climate crisis. But the logic of climate apartheid is that no, these people are expendable because climate apartheid is based, of course, on racial notions. And it's based on this approach that the West, somewhere, somehow, can create a boat for itself and escape the crisis that it has created with years and years of carbon emissions. So the underlying logic of it is that there are people and there are nations that are simply expandable. And what we are continually seeing is that those that are least responsible for the climate crisis are the ones paying the highest price. Take Pakistan, for example, responsible for less than 1% of the climate crisis, but we've seen the horrible impact of the floods, wiping out communities, putting 30% of the country underwater, wiping out billions of tons of topsoil. Now, the fact is, for generations to come, it's going to be difficult to produce food in those areas because the consequences that follow from the floods may actually kill more people than the floods themselves. So those least responsible are paying the highest price. Now, the rich have to pay their climate debt. It's a message that we've been repeating again and again. Because if you look at the 0.1%, they contribute a staggering 2,530 tons per person per year of carbon emissions. These are the rich who are not paying their climate debt to put it. So the fact of the matter is that we have 3.6 billion people in the global south who are facing climate harm. And by 2030, 118 million poor Africans are going to be exposed to floods, to droughts, and to extreme heat. And we heard from Professor Engelbert's presentation yesterday on how the drought nearly wiped out the livestock farming in Botswana, and now it's threatening the Southern African region. But unfortunately, due to this eco-cidal logic, the global north is continuing to invest in fossil fuels. Instead of rapidly investing in renewable energies, it's continuing to go back to fossil fuels. And sort of the war in Ukraine is the largest excuse they have in going back to reinvesting in fossil fuels. Now, the fact that when the world overshot 1 degree Celsius in 2015, the fact of the matter is that the world changed. We lived in a totally different earth, an earth of climate extremes, of unpredictable weather systems that threatens not only our food system, but basically life on earth. And in South Africa, we had about 40 million people facing hunger due to the El Nino that hit us. So these climate extremes, carbon capitalism is not taking them seriously, but instead it's continuing and it's perpetuating its eco-cidal logic. And that needs to stop. But we have to understand how carbon capitalist victory has been able to lock in fossil fuels throughout all of these years. Now, we have to admit that carbon capital won and was able to entrench the use of fossil fuels. Now, despite the climate science, despite the COP multilateral process, carbon capital has continually been victorious in making sure that it locks in fossil fuels. For example, we have to ask, climate science was available in the 90s, but why is it that in the 90s, the COP process did not take the decision to move away from fossil fuels? It already had the climate science even then, so what stopped it even then from taking the decisions that could have prevented a 1.5 overshoot, which now appears impossible to reverse? So what political economy gave conditions and gave rise to this? Now we have to analyze the power of the carbon capitalist lobby in the Washington Beltway, which formed the Global Climate Coalition. Now these are people who invested heavily in undermining climate science. They invested heavily in pseudoscience. They invested heavily in false solutions. And they were able to control the narrative. They were able to control the narrative in writings and in the media. And they invested a lot of money in lobbying senators and lobbying congressmen. As such, the United States became a stumbling block to having any concrete measures to address the climate crisis. So the failure of imperial US leadership has led up to the crisis that we have now. But another victory of carbon capital is from the global south, this sort of catch-up development based on fossil fuels. For example, if you look at the nationally determined contributions, you find several countries in the global south are still going to pursue coal. They are still going to pursue fossil fuel dependent industries because they want to catch up development. But it's a catch-up development premised on fossil fuels. Now, the ruling class eco-fascist project carries two faces. You have center-right neoliberals, and then you have the hard-right neoliberals. Now, the center-right neoliberal response is based on prioritizing all of these shallow solutions, meaning transformations within the system. It's based on climate change, not systems change. So it defends the power of monopoly capital. So these center-right neoliberals are exactly what the Department of Mineral Resources is doing, because it's presenting a shallow transition that if activists are not careful of, is going to lock us further into this eco-cidal logic of capitalism. And then, of course, you have your hard-right neoliberals who completely reject climate science. You saw that with Trumpism. You've seen it around the world with Bolsonaro and all that stuff. So the Glasgow COP and the continuity of the eco-fascist project. Now we have to admit that the process of nationally determined commitments has failed. If you examine the NDCs that were presented before the Glasgow COP, you will find that they only cut emissions by 90%. instead of the needed 50%. Now, South Africa's climate change bill, for example, is based on the 2015 NDC. Meanwhile, South Africa has submitted an updated NDC to the UN Secretariat. So what does that mean? It means that we have a climate change bill that is based on a 2015 NDC that is not in line even with what was submitted to the COP process. Now, the entire process of the NDC is a dismal failure. States are still continuing to invest in fossil fuels. They are still continuing to pursue new investments in things like coal, for example, in fracking, in offshore oil drilling and all that stuff. So the NDC process is a failure, and there is no measure to implement the NDC, and there is no sanction for those who fail to meet their NDC targets. So, for example, like I said, South Africa is still pursuing offshore oil and gas extraction. Now, we wrote in opposition to the proposed gas amendment bill, which is going to introduce and create a large infrastructure for coal extraction. We wrote to Parliament and opposed that bill. But they are also pursuing an upstream petroleum development bill that is going to destroy our oceans, that is going to legalize offshore oil drilling, destroying fisher folk and our heritage. But another thing we have to examine that came out of the Glasgow process was the Net Zero Banking Alliance. This call that banks are actually moving away from investing in fossil fuels and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, that is categorically not true. And what we've continually seen is that large banks are continuing to invest in fossil fuels. So the Net Zero Banking Alliance has been a disastrous failure. Another failure of the Glasgow COP was that climate finance was mystical, because even the climate finance offered to South Africa, we still do not know how it is going to be used. We still do not know the conditions attached to it. And also, the Glasgow COP process continued this liberalized approach of having absolutely no enforcement mechanisms. So it basically undermines itself. But we are seeing maturing contradictions in capitalism's own systemic disruptions. Now, these systemic disruptions within the system of capitalism can be seen, for example, with the decoupling between the United States as well as the China economy. We saw that under the Trump administration. Trump made a call to decouple the US economy from China. And Biden, though he has not come out forcefully to say it, but is continuing the same thing. So, and the US and China, of course, are the two largest economies. But we are beginning to see a decoupling there that could have disastrous consequences for the global economy, but also opportunities. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted many supply chains in a heavily integrated world. So it was also a huge systemic disruption. But Brexit is another disruption. When the UK left the European Union, it left it destabilized. So it was another systemic disruption. But we are seeing around the world, nations or states are rethinking their degrees of integration. They are beginning to undermine the current globalized system. So they are reducing their globalization per se. So we are seeing all of these systemic shifts within the system of capitalism. And of course, the crisis of socio-ecological reproduction, a crisis where you have so much unemployment, for example, in South Africa, structural unemployment, financialized inequality, where people basically cannot live, where people are struggling to survive. So it's a great threat to the system of capitalism. And we've had in South Africa, this structural unemployment has been above 20% since the 1970s. And we just wonder how those people are able to feed themselves in a world of exponentially growing food prices. Another systemic disruption, of course, is the ecological rift of capitalism. The biological disasters that we have seen, zootopic diseases that we have seen, the destruction of the natural habitats as a consequence. And as we go into those natural habitats and destroy them, we expose ourselves to these viruses, and we could have more situations like the coronavirus pandemic. We are seeing climate impacts on the hydrological cycle, to floods, to droughts, and we are seeing the crisis of liberal democracy. So degrees of integration are being undermined. We are seeing pockets of deglobalization. Free market trading is being scrutinized by several countries because it's not working for them. And another disruption is that China is facing financialized over-accumulation challenges. There's a bubble that is going to burst in the Chinese housing market, for example. And of course, the climate and ecological rift that I've spoken about. Madagascar, which has faced 4 tropical cyclones in 2022 that destroyed 90% of agriculture. It's just an example of the climate and ecological rift that we are seeing. So in this context, we have to move beyond symbolic climate justice resistance towards a climate justice bloc of governments, of workers, of peoples and movements. Now we have to analyze climate justice resistance and realize that we've had 2 cycles of climate justice resistance from 2004, 2014, 15. Basically, this was the rejection of all solutions and moved from climate change to systems change. These were 1 degree, and then in 2015 to 2020, we saw another cycle of resistance because from 2015 onwards, when the world overshot 1 degree, we began to see 1 degree Celsius movements. But we have to move beyond symbolic and crowd-centered activism. We have to move towards building a climate justice bloc of governments, of workers, of peoples and movements. And in this, we have to learn crucial lessons from internationalism in the 20th century. We heard it yesterday with Vishy's examples, explaining these examples. So the global climate justice bloc of governments, 1 is centered on global just peace. And when we talk about global just peace, because we cannot continue with things as they are right now, because they threaten the very survival of the human race. So the first call of a global just peace is the disbanding of NATO and the Russian withdrawal from Ukraine. Because as long as we have these antagonistic organizations that are based on a military-industrial complex, we are not going to have peace. Now we need to internationalize support for all struggles. We cannot be working in silos. We have to intensify demands for reparations and payments for climate debt with campaigns like Simane is running, the Debt for Climate campaign. We have to support the phase out of a fossil fuel treaty, which we need urgently. We have to increase ecological carbon and progressive taxes on the rich, because the rich have to pay their ecological debt. We have to have targeted climate sanctions, and also we need legal strategies that challenge climate injustices. The second element is, of course, earth democracy. And by earth democracy, we mean deepening solidarities with indigenous communities, supporting indigenous approaches, because there are many indigenous solutions and approaches to the issues that we have now, which have been excluded, of course, because of colonialism and so on. We have to support those indigenous approaches, and we have to end these exclusionary border regimes. The nation state as we have now cannot be able to help us in the climate crisis. In a world of increasing climate refugees, the nation state is becoming obsolete in dealing with the issue of the climate crisis. And we have to develop a post-UN institutional architecture. As we can see, for example, with the UN Security Council, it's practically disabled, cannot do anything because of veto power and so on. We have to reorganize the world through food sovereignty. This is what Jane was talking about yesterday, these food sovereignty pathways from below. And we must work towards a planetary ecocide law, because we have to stop the destruction of our biodiversity, because without it, we cannot exist on this earth. And we need an earth assembly process. Now, the possible elements of a climate justice deal for Africa, it has to renew a radical pan-Africanism. it has to a radical Pan-Africanism that is not based on meanders of Afro-neoliberalism, nationalism, and racism that creates an other where there are people who are not black enough and so on. So we have to renew a radical Pan-Africanism. We have to demilitarize the entire continent. This means having foreign bases leaving the African continent because they are not protecting Africa anyway. They are protecting their own extraction, protecting their own interests. We must have a universal basic income for all Africans. That is what Awande was talking about in the South African context. We need a deep, just transition plan for the entire African continent, and we need to establish a climate reparations fund for Africa, because Africa is owed a climate debt, and South Africa is part of those who are owing the African continent, because we have been a large emitter over all these years. We need to develop early warning and disaster management systems, like the one Professor Engelbrecht was talking about yesterday, between the community working together with scientists and so on. And we need to control of strategic resources and minerals. There are several rare earth minerals produced in the African continent. If we do not have strategic control over those resources and minerals, then we'll continually be a net exporter of minerals, continually being poor. And we have to move beyond the AU, because the AU has not been able to deal with the problems that we have, and the AU has not been transformative enough in its approach. So the South African Climate Justice Project has been championing climate justice struggles. And as we all know, thank you. As we all know, the CJCM is located within, the CJCM is born out of struggles with communities over droughts. It's born out of the lived experiences of people. But CJCM has always has to be located in the making of global climate justice politics. The basic needs of communities are, of course, the basis of the link between the climate crisis and injustices. I think this is something that came out a lot from our panelists yesterday. And the CJCM, as you know, has championed the People's Food Sovereignty Act, which you can find on the South African Food Sovereignty website. Now, the CJC is anti-capitalist, emancipatory feminist, decolonial, and it's basically about emancipatory ecology. Now, one of the documents you have received today, and it's sent back there by Awande, is the strategic perspective document. What next for the climate justice charter movement? It's important for each and every comrade to have. It advances the theory of change centered on climate justice project, defending our commons, advancing deep transformation through democratic systemic reforms, as well as strategic transformation through climate justice political project. It has all our systemic alternatives, which was presenting one yesterday, UPIC, water commons, rights of nature, zero waste, food sovereignty, and the climate justice deal for the country. So it's an important document that comes out of strategic engagement. And finally, we have to face the challenges to planetize our movement and to end eco-cidal capitalism. Now, one of the biggest challenges is going beyond single issue activism. It's something that came out quite strongly from our panelists yesterday, that we have to go beyond single issue activism, because this is a poly-crisis and it cannot be addressed that way. We also need to go beyond symbolic politics, because it's not sufficient. We have to go beyond apocalyptic climate politics, the politics of doonism and so on and so forth. Climate justice activism has to be about trans politics. That means feminists going beyond issues that directly affect women only. That means those advocating for food sovereignty, creating linkages in struggles. That's what it means by trans politics. So climate justice politics also has to go beyond crowd politics. We've had crowds before, we've had marches before, but those crowds have not produced the systemic changes that we need. So it has to go beyond mere crowd politics. Finally, climate justice forces have to really and actively support the building of a climate justice bloc of governments, and this is possible. All power to the people. All power to the people. Thank you very much.
we've got a lot of time till 9:45. So comments, questions, engagements. Let's go for it, comments. This is deep strategic analysis of the global. And it's not just about a block of governments. It's about peoples. It's about movements. It's about workers. There are parts of the planet that are heating at twice the global average, like our sub-region. In the Middle East, they are also heating at twice the global average. The Arctic is heating the fastest. These places and the people and non-human life that exists there are going to be hit very, very hard. Island states are going to be disappearing, okay, once we overshoot 1.5 degrees Celsius. And they've been rallying for a long time as vulnerable nation states to get support, and no one's listening, okay? So we need to rally with them. We need to rally with countries that are being devastated by shocks, poorer countries under the yoke of structural adjustment and debt. And we need to get workers and worker movements. We have global union federations on this planet. We have a global peasant movement, La Via Campesina, over 200 million members. Okay. We need to start gathering these forces, and we need to start building convergences. We need to reconstitute power relations at a global level. Now, that hasn't been done, sadly, over the 2 cycles of resistance. It hasn't been done, and we've got to take it there. And so one of the ideas, just to emphasize in the document, if you read the documents, comrades, is that the CJCM convenes a coordinating council and assembly of vulnerable governments, peoples, workers, and movements. In the context of online technology, etc., we can do this. We convened an assembly against vaccine apartheid. We had Jeremy Corbyn, we had some of the leading trade union federations on a planetary scale. We had La Via Campesina, all our allies that we all linked to came to that assembly. What stops us from convening all those forces now in the context of the climate crisis? Rashida.
Good morning, everybody. Amandla, power. You know what struck me as I was listening to Charles, that we are basically discussing the future of life. We need to realize that our voices need to be deepened, that broad-based consciousness needs to be embarked upon with immediate effect. What are we going to do about that? We are sitting around this room today representing the working class, and we cannot leave here this afternoon without having the plan for implementation. I think, and I'm not the best one to think that, could I depend on this? Now, I think that, you know, the consciousness of the person on the ground, I'm getting goosebumps thinking of the future of my grandchildren. I'm thinking, what world are they going to live in? And we need to start, Geronimo, in a primary school, in a very simplistic manner of educating that young child in a very simple way, in his mother tongue, about what climate justice means. It is important for us as we leave here to take accountability for this. We have been made wise by the climate justice movement. And we need to take responsibility as we leave here today. Yes. What is the role? We cannot leave here without a time frame. We cannot leave here without saying, for October, we are doing 1, 2, 3. For November, 1, 2, 3. By the end of the year, we do a national thing. I'm still getting cold shivers as I speak. I'm 70 years old. Yes, I am. Almost. February next year, if God wills, I'll turn 70. But, but what I'm saying is, my heart beats for the future of life, for the future of the generations to come. Let us commit today to a plan with time frames, because Comrade Bish, if there's no time frames, we don't execute. There has to be targets. There has to be time frames. So let's do that plan. Thank you, comrades.
Thanks. Anybody else? We've got time for it. Your thoughts about what we living in.
Switch the system.
Hi, good morning and good day to everybody. I just wanted to say what my comrade just said now. I had the same thing while listening. But what I want to add is, since 2015, I've been part of this forum. And we always had briefings and sharing and presentations. And then we go back to our own organizations and we share with them. But I think that is not enough. Like Rashida said, I think we should really take some action to have some things happening, like if you start on a local level, having a community dialogue with your network partners, first with your organization, like we are a national organization, we can like have one in KZN, in Johannesburg, in Beaufort, in George, wherever we are, with those youth that can be trained, and they should be trained on this whole thing, and then they go further and spread it into the communities with other youth and things like that. Then we can look at national organizations, not national, I would say Western Cape. Bring your network partners together and share all this with them. Have a material that is developed that you can hand out so that people not just listen to things, they can also read, they can see, like what we had here. If we can share that with a broad movement of people, then more people will know about it. People just hear the word climate change and I don't think they care or understand what it is about and how serious it is, and that we should all work together. And then we have campaigns at schools and things like that on other things. We can add that to it. But the only thing here is resources are limited. You then have to raise funds to make that happen. Because on a grassroots level, I don't think we have resources to manage that. That is why we could always just touch on it. You know, with our own children, our own members, and spread it there. But then it's not going further than that. So I think we should look at that. I've got 4 proposals that I will on. Is one that you gave me a recommendation later to train youth, but I think we should really get some action on that. Thank you.
So yeah, Nosintu and then Karuna.
One last thing. The program of action. We need to live with it now. What I can suggest is that firstly, Comrade Ignorant to actually work on that. I remember Comrade Fish was talking about possible end of the year CJC launch. Then the program of action is, how about we from here, when we get in our village or wherever we are, we can like videoize or document something live what we are doing from now to that time and send that to him so that he can compile that documentary and present it on that day. Secondly, if we mean that we want to involve children, Jane, I propose if you can give me some more paints and all that. When Cooking Fish said that we need to paint our villages, CJC thing, every household, what I want to do when I get home, because I work mostly with children in this. I remember 2018, 17, when we here, when I came back home, I introduced the CJC to the children in my village. I still have those photos in my website and videos. And when we get there now, we give the children, we involve schools, we give the children the paints, we introduce this to them, we ask them to draw what they think of the future, what they see now, because they see something I know. I asked them and they told me. Then they can paint anything. If possible, funds permits, each and every one of us in that lodge, you bring a child that is going to stand here and present what they have been doing in their villages here in that lodge. We give them time and their platform so that they can be able to show off things.
Thank you. Very good. Karuna? And then Marcus?
If we look at our generation, we've been isolated from the globe. If we had one of the pillars of the struggle was, to get the international against anti-apartheid. We have the opportunity with technology now to do something different. And if we want to actually move away from symbolic climate justice resistance, communities, all those kinds of things that we know about, that actually gets done and really have some independence from the donor organizations and the multilateral organizations. What we need to do is start having an exchange program between people in different parts of the South, where the locals here actually begin to engage with other people and talk about the commonalities that they face in their struggles. I'm hearing us talk only about mobilizing our own people. Like we did in the 80s, and we failed. We failed miserably. Look at the type of leadership you have right now. If you do the same thing now, without bringing in new ideas, fresh ideas, and taking things across, you need to consider that as one approach, and that might help you and your compatriots in other places of the world to fight multilateral organizations that leave the South out of things, that leaves the developing world out of things. But we also have to consider how we're going to challenge investors. The president in this country thinks the economy will be fixed by investment. So everything is about an investment conference, and I'm not too sure that we're getting it. We still have a very high rate of unemployment, and we're not growing the economy at all. The issue about the investors is in Africa, China, and India have actually come in, and they've taken strategic resources. So it's no more just looking at America and what Europe has been doing in Africa. It's everybody who has been doing in Africa, and we continue to do it. And so we need to get people to challenge the investors, because it's very easy to say we don't have jobs. So let the Chinese come and let them continue with coal mining in the country. It's very easy to do that, but it's very difficult to get people to make a choice that, we will continue to suffer a little bit longer, but this is not what we want. And we did this. The workers did this. Workers actually went on strike and didn't get paid a day's wage. we could do it. We have do it. We have. There is one more thing in terms of, the global picture that we need to take into account.
Issue is really about the right fascism and the right-wing religious fundamentalism that's on the rise throughout the world. And the work that we do to challenge the authorities around climate change, around climate justice, and about inequalities that people face and hunger that people face and exploitation actually get muted by that. Now, this knows no boundaries. It's Christian fundamentalism, Jewish fundamentalism, Hindu fundamentalism, Islamic fundamentalism, and it continues. And it actually increases to becoming terror. So I think, someone may just
Thank you for that. I think we have Marcus Solomon online. Can we bring him in? Marcus, go ahead. Can he hear you? Marcus, go ahead. Unmute. Unmute, Marcus. We can't hear you.
Marcus, please try again. Please unmute.
Is there anybody else who has a question or comment in the meantime? So, Imran, Michelle, good. Go ahead. Break the ice.
I think we're not politicizing the climate justice movement sufficiently within our local structures. As community organizations on the ground, we have agency within our various ward forums, within our regional sub-councils, within our own political parties, if we belong to those structures. So we have to put climate justice on the agenda within our ward forum, ward committees, with our local councillors, with our sub-council, because and we must influence, we won't be able to get 100% what we want, but we can influence the thinking, we can influence the programs, we can influence the IDPs, the integrated development plans for each ward and for each sub-council. So we have agency on the ground. If we mobilize sufficiently through our organizations and our membership and our networks, it's not difficult to have a picket outside a council meeting and say, listen guys, you inside, you start listening, what's this side? And if enough of the constituencies on the ground are sending these kind of messages to the immediate political servants, remember they serve us, we place them there, whether they belong to the ANC or the Western Cape, mostly DA, we'll be able to force change much easier than continued resistance. I think we have to have a dual approach in terms of the resistance. That we increase our resistance, we increase our strategies, we increase our development of policies. But at the same time, as we deal with our plans submitting to Parliament, if they don't implement it, at least we've got the paper trail and the leverage to really go into protest mode and to go into pressure mode, because we've given you the problem, we've given you the solution. The only missing element is the political will to implement and to change. So I think a lot of our work needs to go from grassroots to the political structures that we have available at our disposal, because they are there for a purpose. And our politics for a long time has been to ignore those structures, but I think our councillor that's in the House and the traditional leaders that we spoke about yesterday, that there are power structures that can be influenced, and that is where we can really make immediate gains. Not really solving the problems, but really making the gains in terms of increasing the frequency of the climate justice debate within the structures of power. And if it is from the bottom up, it will be from the ward council, to the sub-council, to the regional council, to the chamber, to the provincial province, to the mayor's office. So in each of our municipalities, we have these structures that we can influence and that we should influence. Yeah, and that influence comes from the real threat that we are sufficiently organized. We spoke about that yesterday, organized and mobilized. That we are sufficiently organized to become a real threat come elections. So I think we should look at that as our most low-hanging fruit in terms of interventions.
Okay, great. Let's move on. I think it was Michelle, and then it was yourself. Somebody else had a hand up here.
Thanks. It's Michelle Williams. I'm part of COPAC and Wits University. And I because in some ways I was going to mention something similar, that especially that it is a depressing time on the one hand, but I also feel like it's a very hopeful time. For the first time in many years, we no longer have to fight to get people to believe that fossil fuel capitalism is the source of the problem. And so we're now at least recognizing the real problem. And there's been, so the last 2 weeks we've been in, Fish and I both are part of teaching this social theory course to trade unionists. And there was NUM and ANCU were in the room, shop stewards from those places. And the lock-ins that we've talked about are very deep. I mean, they're afraid of losing jobs. They're not against change, but they're afraid, they don't trust that it's going to be just. And in the past, it was hard for them to even to see that necessity. And now they're not, they want the change too. They're saying we're getting affected by this as much as anyone of the crises, the food, everything. But they don't know how to make sure it's just. And I think so in many ways, I think around the multiple levels and scales on which we have to link up with and find allies has grown in orders of magnitude from COVID, actually. So I think lots of different entities that may have resisted some of these spaces are now more open. And I think that's a very hopeful moment. But I think, Charles, in some ways, if the lock-ins, I think it's easy to blame the state, and I think our state has failed. But these lock-ins of, think about our infrastructure in this country. Think about Richard. I mean, the lock-ins are so deep that to shift to these other forms is not an easy thing. I mean, we need to take that very seriously. Like, how do we shift it that we ensure that there's a real just way to shift it and that our infrastructures can be repurposed? And then finally, one of the things yesterday, this program I was part of, we had the graduation for the students yesterday, and the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung is one of our funders for that program. And there was a woman from Germany, the head office there, and she was saying that they're very strongly lobbying on their side for this green fund that's coming to South Africa that they're in negotiations with, because they're saying we don't want it from their side. The Social Democratic Party doesn't want it to be just large capital investment. They want it to be community. They want it to be kind of community-led programs, because that's what they have too. And so she was saying, we need partners on the ground here too. We want, because they're pushing from their side. And so I think there's a lot of ways in which there are alliances starting to develop that we might not be aware of, but they're happening, I think.
On this side, oh, Marcus, is Marcus ready?
Yeah, I found as always
Go ahead. Bravo. Go ahead.
Comrades, thank you very much.
Comrades, thank you very
What I want to say, oh, I'm echoing. I'm sorry, man. I think there's an echo here. Can you hear me now?
You can hear you fine.
Okay. First, I want to congratulate Charles and the team for preparing a very important, interesting document. What I want to say is that when we launched the Right to Food for Children campaign 6 months ago, we prepared a document and called for a unity of all organizations, but primarily with more than 200,000 community-based organizations, composed mainly of women. And as I explained yesterday, we've had meetings with 500 to 600 women in various parts of the West Cape Town. And without exception, the call is for unity, equally important for peace. Now, what is the significance of that in this context is that we're not trying to only build a new society. We're fighting for survival. We're preparing our communities for survival. And what also comes clearly, like one mother said, if there's a flood, it's fine for you, Comrade Marcus, to speak about Marx and all these other things, but I need the hand of my neighbor when that water comes down that road. And we've seen it graphically in what happened in Pakistan, when a third of the country is underwater. And all the scientists now, social scientists of society, the historical materialists, are saying we need solidarity. Now, I don't want to be long, except to say, and I want to zoom in again on the issue of children. 40 years ago, when we launched this campaign of working with children, the idea was to build a new society, the new person. And it's not to teach them, it's to create a new environment, starting with yourself. So we can speak all the wonderful things here. But if we are not going to be transforming ourselves, when we go and speak to children, and they see in front of you somebody who abuses the planet, you overeat, you overconsume, you overdress, because the big problem is consumption of food. We have to stop eating so much sugar. We must become healthy. Basically, what I want to say, we're going to come back. We've launched the 1 million spekboom planting campaign for children. Because what we've learned is that over the last years, we stop preaching to them. Let's create an environment through projects, cleaning the street, love nature, etc. So what I'm saying, as like my colleague Shanaza said, we're a founding member of the, proudly we say, of the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign, and we always emphasize the issue of children. Not that we're not aware of the importance of the community organizations, but I think what we need to do really with all this wonderful information is what already is becoming obvious. We need to build, this group of people here in this organization has a major role to play out there. And I think we must be in the front line of calling for broad unity in diversity. It doesn't mean we're going to stop building the the climate justice charter. In fact, it becomes stronger. And like Shanaza said, how do we bring that to it? We've done it already. We've started building a charter movement amongst the children. Love nature. In fact, the president of Colombia made a brilliant speech the other day in the United Nations. And he said, we must build peace, not only amongst ourselves as human beings, but also come to peace with nature. Stop the destruction of where we are staying. But like the mothers, and I want to come back to this, if we can't build peace, the mothers are leading the struggle against the gangsters. We must really build a peace movement so that we can build the new eco-socialist human being that's going to fight for survival. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. I think there was a hand there at the back.
Thanks. Somebody say something about the organs of people's power that we actually built last time there was a crisis of this nature in the 1970s, which had a very similar constellation. With similar things going on. And it was essentially a Fordist New Deal order of accumulation that was collapsing and being replaced by a rising neoliberal order. We kind of shifts in production and how production is organized. And I disagree that we were unsuccessful. I think that to some degree, where we are now is precisely because we were successful in building those organs of people's power during that period. And that the attempt to set up an alternative governmental approach to democracy can be seen in the constitutional structures that we've inherited. So even though the ward committees and the councils and the assemblies have been captured by a neoliberal model of development, the very fact of their existence holds democratic potential. And I think that what we're seeing now is that this neoliberal model is actually collapsing. Okay. And what seems to be kind of on the table to replace it is some kind of neo-feudalism, sort of global corporations in charge of everything from information to energy, etc. But the space still exists for us to do a similar thing to what we did last time, not quite the same, but prefigurative organs of power, in this case economic power, and the power to engage and control the environment in which we live. And particularly around the new technologies that allow us to actually take control of the reproduction of daily life. So all of this has been touched on in this conference so far, food, water, energy, waste to manufacturing, and we can move up the technological chain from there. And if you see it that way, all manufacturing systems in the next 20 or 30 years are going to have some kind of distributed, localized nature. That's where manufacturing technology is going. And so the mode of production and the forms of organization will necessarily follow that. The question becomes, are they under control of some kind of eco-fascism, or they're under control of some kind of democratic structure? And we're fortunate in the sense that the technology lends itself to distribution and to democratization. So in a way, we're in a situation where it's possible for us to do this kind of thing relatively easily, not easily, but in comparison to setting up an industrial state that the Soviet Bloc had to do in the 1930s. This is technologically going to be, well, it's so easy to accomplish, but politically it's difficult, etc. Maybe I'll leave it there, except just to say that in doing it, so we should be thinking like good Leninists, you know, what are the principled alliances, what are the strategic alliances, and what are the tactical alliances? And from a tactical point of view, at the sort of grassroots level, we can be very creative. And we can contest production of those fundamentals as basic almost anywhere, using the current technologies that are relatively freely available. And the idea should be that we build new production systems inside, alongside the existing systems, even to the point of participating in value chains, even as a tactical operation. So we could supply this to the supermarkets with vegetables, for example, in place like Pozikili. So what I'm arguing for is the socialization of production, capture of surplus value, and then a long-term building of socialized democratic production.
Thanks, Patrick. I mean, just to say that your point connects with what Imran was raising, except Imran, this is consistent with this paradigm of power that we're talking about, where we are building the alternative means to sustain life. We're building the alternative food systems. We are building an approach to how we manage water in our communities. How do we adapt them to the challenges that are coming and so on? And we plan that. That's the tool we shared with everyone yesterday, where we get our communities involved in developing a local plan to deal with decarbonization adaptation as part of a local climate justice deal. And then we fight the fight. Then we hit the councils, then we hit whoever, etc. But the initiative lies with us, with the people on the ground. And we start building that next society. And so if there are obstacles to us feeding our communities, there's no land or there isn't enough water, we push them on that as we build the next systems. I think this is the policy. I mean, we've been doing it. But I think the nuance is this. This is what we mean by accelerating and deepening the just transition. Okay, because the change, comrades, is not going to come from the top. It's not. In the next paper, you'll see how the South African state is really going in the opposite direction, and we wanted to go in this direction. And it's a behemoth. It's locked in, and it's a big challenge. The only way we can break things and open up a new pathway is building the power, building the new systems, and scaling that up. So you had your hand up as well. Okay, first Rashida, yeah. And then we're going to wrap up and give it to Charles to respond.
Yeah. Okay, is it on? Yes, yeah. You know, coming from a national movement of the informal economy, you know, we have provincial structures all over the country. I realize that government is very busy with the informal sector because they realized that that's the only sector that can actually build the economy. There's no more jobs, unemployment, people become entrepreneurs. And as such, and I'm sure many of you in this room as well, we get invited to national fora. On Tuesday next week, I'm in KZN in Durban. We are doing the Informal Economy Build Back Better program. But I realized what a great opportunity. The Premier, the Mayor, and the ANC Small Business Member of Parliament are in that room. So at every opportunity we have, even yesterday, I just received the invitation of national government and Western Cape government discussing the district model for economic development. That brings about the community. Who does the district model impact on? Yes, it's where the three spheres of government are coming together because we've been complaining about the different forms of government. So now they're developing a district model. And it's in that district model that we can have impact as well. Economy cannot move without the climate justice being addressed. So wherever we are, we place the agenda of the climate justice. We force the agenda of the climate justice and link it up with the economic development. I've also just realized that, we are part of the SADC group, 15 countries in SADC. And all we talk about there is sustainable economy, the sustainable economic development of the people. And we never once spoke about climate justice. So what I'm saying is, what I'm proposing, whenever you are in any meeting, raise and push the agenda of climate justice.
Yes. Thank you. Your turn.
I think it was more just a point on.
I won't hear you.
Yesterday when I was reading this paper, I was also thinking a lot about the eco-cidal logic of capitalism, and another example that comes to mind is that, I'm not sure how many of you have been following, but the Nord Stream, there's been this explosion, and it's potentially going to be the largest methane emission release on the planet currently going on, which is just another reiteration of the example of how war, because they're suggesting, who knows, but they're suggesting that it was the Russians that were behind the bombing of this pipeline, because it provides most of Europe's gas. So it's another example of the eco-cidal logic of capitalism and war at work happening right now, and I think is another reason for us to just think about these dynamics at work in our planet currently going on. And I just thought it was a good example.
Excellent point. Gino, and then back to Johnson. Yeah. We're running out of time, Gino.
Can I just speak?
You said we had a lot of time.
Huh?
Earlier you said we had a lot of time.
That was before you spoke.
Everybody is going.
Thank you. Any chance, it was amazing, and my mind was just racing in how we could do this. Right? I just want to make 2 points. The first thing is that I was thinking about, when you speak about, the possibilities of coalitions and building it, right, and building it at national, SADC, continental, and global level. And I was just trying to figure out, so to what extent there could be a convergence by the big players, beyond Greenpeace and so on. And I think that's something worth exploring. This is the moment, and I like the idea that actually it's a great moment. This is something that our generation could lay the basis for the next, actually. So and the second thing is the interconnectivity of these struggles.
Yeah. So
we're not in linear struggles,
Yeah.
And I love that. Part of what I'm doing right now, you might know, is that I'm working on a global organizing school for young people, for young activists. And the big challenge, the question is, how are we going to connect all these struggles in a meaningful way? And I think you have the beginnings of the kind of connections. And the last point, though, and so it's really great. And the extent to which you can go into all those forums and get people mobilized and organized onto the side and allow, the kind of debates to continue, I think is the extent to which we can really crack this. And the reason why I'm saying this is because even within what we call civil society, this animal of civil society, we're still so fragmented. And that's part of a subjective reality. And this is what our enemies on the other side like. They love it.
Yeah.
They'll carry on with they'll continue with their business so long as they know that we are divided.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing about it is that, I've learned and I've discovered, and maybe you will find, agreement with this, that you speak about bottom up and top down. What you have and what you were trying to do with Parliament is to create the top down framework for what could be, a new society, right? Through the bill, through the charter, right? It's a brilliant idea. What could be the bottom up, popular discourse, if you like, amongst ordinary people And I've, for a few years, I worked with people in rural village. And when you speak about climate change and so on, that's one thing. But when you speak about the fact that the cattle, that the fur of the cattle is shining in winter, people can make the connection. The ability to bring climate change issues into kind of day-to-day realities of the people, and then people make the connection. It's what we did in the 80s, Caribbean. You want to go and talk socialism with people on door-to-door in a place like Chatsworth, they will tell you, don't worry, God is my savior. But if you speak about long grass and what is happening, with the snakes and so on, people will be jolted into action. And I think, so the bottom up and the top down, and Charles, is what they say, is harmony is created when the two meet. Yes. When the frameworks from the top permeates in society, in communities. And I like what Simane was talking about, using the structures there. Those are the democratic structures that could be used. We create them and then we ignore them. But then also get people in their own way to start relating and building those kind of struggles in whatever language. And I think when we do that, we'll find that top down and bottom up, at the point that they meet, they say harmony is created.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, over to you, Charles, to respond, and I'll just make it.
And thank you so much, comrades, for all the points you have raised. I cannot respond to them one by one. But what is clear is that sobering reality is what Comrade Rashida said, that we are discussing the future of life. And we are saying that eco-cidal capitalism, there's no interest in solving the problem. For example, we are seeing Germany signing new liquefied natural gas deals with Saudi Arabia. Those are not just for the interim, but these are 10-year deals, for example, that could be extended. And in return, the Germans are selling arms to Saudi Arabia despite the bans. Eco-cidal capitalism is also premised on violence. But also, if you look at the 60 largest banks, they have spent about over $4 trillion investing in fossil fuels. That is despite all the rhetoric about moving away from fossil fuels as well as funding renewable energies. But what is also clear, comrades, is that indeed there is potential, and this is the right time for a global climate justice bloc of governments, workers, peoples, and movements. It has the potential to emerge beyond just national struggles. Unities with frontline states like the islands that are basically facing extinction because of the rising sea levels and because of the floods they are facing. Unity with coastal communities, unity with countries in global hotspots like our own in the Southern African region, unities with countries that are owed the climate debt. But of course, it's not going to be easy to build these unities. But just because it's difficult, it doesn't mean we cannot do it. We must do it because it is the only way to build these convergences and to build a new internationalism to address the climate crisis. It's possible, and the energy is there, and it's also part of our intergenerational legacy, because the next generations should inherit a better world. And if we do not work hard to implement all of these things, if we do not work hard to unite all of these forces, we are going to continue on this eco-cidal path, because the climate emergency is here and now, and it has to be addressed, and the potential is there. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John. I'm just going to add just three points. Comrades, if you look at the document that Charles was speaking to, there's a map here. There's $400 billion of gas investment planned for our continent. Okay, and it gets more salience in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So many Western governments now want this to unfold on our continent. And so Africa is a major battleground in terms of our climate justice future. And we really want you to take that point home, comrades. Linked to this is the point about demilitarization and denuclearization of the world. What this document is calling for, Biden spends $800 billion odd on the military industrial complex to pump up the war in Ukraine. Now, they have been failing to give us the 100 billion per annum for the climate fund since 2015. Okay, so money is going into violence and bombs and destruction. And we've got to challenge that head on with this agenda. And we're saying demilitarization, denuclearization of the planet. They didn't take the opportunity when Gorbachev gave it to them to denuclearize our planet. It could have been a turning point in world history. But we've got to use the Ukraine moment to make that argument. The West is escalating that conflict. The madness in the Kremlin is escalating that conflict. And it's very, very dangerous for all of us. And in the context of where we need to be going, in terms of confronting the climate crisis, these wars are a distraction. But they're part of the eco-cidal logic of capitalism. I just want comrades to note those points and just finally, just to underline this issue of the point that Rashida made about a program. I think that's how we're going to conclude today, in a very systematic way around what each one of us has to be doing in terms of moving things forward. Yeah. Comrades, we press for time. Where's our one day? Our one day come. You can share yourself.